Maria Santos stepped off the Greyhound bus into the humid Georgia air, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder and her service uniform pressed and clean. Pine Valley was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone, where pickup trucks outnumbered cars 3-1, and where strangers were noticed before they'd taken 10 steps down Main Street. She'd come here for a fresh start, to be closer to her elderly grandmother who lived in the assisted living facility on Maple Avenue. After 8 years in the Army, including 3 deployments overseas, Maria was ready for something quieter. The local Veterans Affairs office had offered her a position as a counselor, helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. It seemed perfect. The first person she encountered was Buck Morrison, a large man in his 50s who owned a hardware store. He was loading bags of fertilizer into his truck when he spotted her uniform. His eyes narrowed as he took in her petite frame, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, and her youthful face that made her look younger than her 32 years. "Well, well," Buck said loudly enough for the other men gathered around his truck to hear. "Looks like we got ourselves a little soldier girl. What did you do in the Army, honey? Push papers around." The men chuckled, and Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being underestimated. She'd faced this countless times during her military career, but it never got easier. She kept walking, her back straight and her eyes forward. "I'm talking to you, sweetheart," Buck called after her. "This ain't the big city. We're friendly folk here." Maria turned around, offering a polite smile. "I'm Maria Santos. I'll be working at the VA office," Santos, Buck repeated, drawing out the name. "You, one of them foreign soldiers. Thought the Army was for real Americans." The comment hit like a slap, but Maria had heard worse. Her grandfather had been born in Mexico, but her family had been American for 3 generations. She'd served her country with pride and honor, but explaining that to men like Buck felt pointless. "I was born in Texas," she said simply. Buck's friend, a thin man named Dale, stepped forward. "You sure don't look like much of a soldier. My nephew just got back from basic training, and he's twice your size. How'd a little thing like you even make it through boot camp?" "Maybe they got different standards for the ladies," another man suggested, and they all laughed again. Maria's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "If you'll excuse me, I need to find my apartment." As she walked away, she heard Buck's voice carry across the street. "Apartment's probably above Chen's restaurant, only place in town that'd rent to someone like her." The comment stung because it was true. Maria had found it surprisingly difficult to secure housing in Pine Valley. Most landlords had seemed eager to rent to her over the phone, but their enthusiasm cooled when they met her in person. Mrs. Chen, who owned the Chinese restaurant, had been the only one willing to offer her the small apartment above the kitchen. Found the restaurant and climbed the narrow stairs to her new home. It was tiny but clean, with a view of the town square from the single window. She set down her bag and sat on the edge of the bed, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. She'd faced enemy fire without flinching, had led soldiers through some of the most dangerous territory on Earth, and had earned commendations for bravery that most people couldn't even pronounce. But somehow, the cruel words of small-town bullies could still cut her deep. The next morning, Maria dressed carefully for her first day at the VA office. She chose civilian clothes, hoping to blend in better, but kept her bearing military. The office was located in a converted house on the edge of downtown, with a small sign that read Pine Valley Veterans Services. Her supervisor, Robert Hayes, was a kindly man in his 60s who'd served in Vietnam. He welcomed her warmly and showed her around the modest facility. "We don't get much excitement here," Robert explained as they walked through the building. "Mostly older vets who need help with disability claims or younger ones struggling to adjust. You'll do good work here, Maria. This town needs someone with your experience." Maria felt a flutter of hope. Maybe Pine Valley would be different than she'd first thought. That afternoon she decided to walk to the grocery store to pick up supplies for her apartment. As she passed Buck's hardware store, she noticed a small crowd gathered on the sidewalk. An elderly man was sitting on the ground, his face pale and his breathing labored. Without hesitation, Maria rushed over. "Sir, are you okay?" "What's your name, Harold?" the man gasped. "Can't catch my breath." Maria knelt beside him, her training taking over. She checked his pulse and noticed the blue tinge around his lips. "Harold, do you have any heart problems? Are you taking any medications?" Buck pushed through the crowd. "What's going on here? Harold, you alright? He needs medical attention immediately," Maria said, pulling out her phone to call 911. "Looks like he might be having a heart attack." "Now hold on there, little lady," Buck said dismissively. "Harold just gets winded sometimes. He'll be fine." "No," Maria said firmly. her voice carrying the authority she'd developed as a sergeant. "This man needs help now. Someone get me a chair so we can keep him comfortable until the ambulance arrives." She turned to Harold, speaking in a calm, reassuring voice. "Harold, I need you to stay with me. Take slow, shallow breaths. Help is coming." The crowd watched in silence as Maria took charge of the situation. She loosened Harold's collar, monitored his pulse, and kept him conscious with steady conversation. When the paramedics arrived 5 minutes later, she gave them a clear, professional report of Harold's symptoms and vital signs. As they loaded Harold into the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to Maria. "Good work. You might have saved his life." Buck stood with his mouth open, clearly surprised by what he'd witnessed. But as the ambulance drove away and the crowd dispersed, Maria heard him mutter to his friends, "Lucky guess. Anyone could have done that." Maria walked home that evening feeling the weight of the day's events. She'd proven herself once already, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. In her experience, respect had to be earned over and over again, especially when you didn't fit people's expectations of what a hero should look like. She thought about the tattoo hidden beneath her uniform shirt, just below her collarbone. Was small and simple, but it carried the weight of everything she'd been through, everything she'd sacrificed, and everyone she'd lost along the way. Someday, maybe the people of Pine Valley would understand what it meant. But for now, she'd have to prove herself the hard way, one small act of courage at a time. 2 weeks into her new job, Maria had settled into a routine. She arrived at the VA office early each morning, spent her days counseling veterans and helping them navigate the complex world of government benefits, and walked home through the quiet streets as the sun set behind the Georgia pines. Her work was rewarding, but the social isolation was harder than she'd expected. Most of the townspeople remained politely distant, and she'd overheard enough whispered conversations to know that Buck Morrison had been spreading his opinions about her throughout Pine Valley. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon when James Mitchell walked into her office. He was a young man, maybe 25, with the telltale signs of someone struggling with invisible wounds. His hands shook slightly, his eyes darted around the room, and he jumped at every unexpected sound. "I heard there was someone here who might understand," James said quietly, taking the seat across from her desk. Maria leaned forward, her voice gentle. "I'm here to listen. James, what's going on?" For the next hour, James poured out his story. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, lost 3 close friends to an IED explosion, and come home to a town that expected him to simply pick up where he'd left off. He couldn't sleep, couldn't hold a job, and was starting to have thoughts that scared him. "Everyone keeps telling me I should be grateful to be home," James said, his voice breaking. "They say I'm lucky compared to the guys who didn't make it back, but I feel like I'm drowning, and nobody understands." Maria knew exactly what he meant. She'd felt that same suffocating weight after her first deployment, the guilt of surviving when others hadn't, the frustration of trying to explain war to people who'd never seen it. "You're not alone, James," she said, "and you're not broken. You're dealing with trauma, and that takes time to heal, but we can work through this together." Over the following weeks, James became her first regular client. They met twice a week, working through his experiences and developing coping strategies. Slowly, Maria watched him begin to stabilize. He found a part-time job at the auto repair shop and started sleeping through the night. Word of Maria's success with James began to spread through the veteran community. Soon, she had a steady stream of clients, men and women who'd served their country and were struggling to find their place in civilian life. But her growing reputation in the veteran community only seemed to fuel Buck Morrison's resentment. He made it his mission to undermine her at every opportunity. "Don't know why we need some outsider telling our boys how to live," he said loudly. At the diner one morning, we took care of our own just fine before she showed up. The situation came to a head on a Friday afternoon in early October. Maria was walking home from work when she heard shouting from the town square. She hurried toward the commotion and found James Mitchell facing off against Buck and 2 of his friends. "You need to calm down, boy," Buck was saying, his voice full of condescension. "Whatever that woman's been filling your head with, it ain't helping nobody." James was shaking, but Maria could see the anger in his eyes. "Don't talk about her like that. She's done more for me than anyone in this town ever has." "She's got you thinking you're some kind of victim," Buck shot back. "Real men don't need counseling. They handle their problems." "I said don't talk about her like that." James's voice cracked, and Maria could see he was on the edge of losing control. She stepped forward quickly. "James, it's okay. Let's go." Buck turned his attention to her, his face flushed with anger. This is your fault. You've got these boys thinking they're damaged goods instead of teaching them to toughen up. That's not what I'm doing, Maria said calmly, though her heart was racing. I'm helping them process trauma so they can heal. Trauma? Buck spat. You know what trauma is. My daddy fought in Korea and never said a word about it. My uncle was at D-Day and came home and went straight back to work. They didn't need some little girl holding their hands. A crowd was gathering, and Maria could feel their eyes on her. Some faces showed curiosity, others skepticism, and a few showed the kind of cruel anticipation that came with watching a public confrontation. Times were different then, Maria said, keeping her voice steady. We understand more about the effects of combat stress now. There's no shame in getting help. Shame, Buck laughed bitterly. You want to talk about shame? The shame is sending soldiers like you overseas to begin with. What could a little thing like you possibly do in a real war? The crowd was silent now, waiting for her response. Maria felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when facing down insurgents in Kandahar or standing her ground during rocket attacks on the forward operating base. I did my job, she said simply. Your job, Buck repeated mockingly. Let me guess. You were a secretary, maybe a cook, something safe, away from the real fighting. James stepped forward again. You don't know what you're talking about. I can speak for myself, James, Maria said, placing a gentle hand on his arm. She looked directly at Buck, her dark eyes steady and unwavering. I served 8 years in the army, 3 combat deployments. I did what my country asked of me. Sure you did, sweetheart, Buck said with a sneer, and I'm sure you got a nice little ribbon to show for it. The crowd was getting restless now, sensing the tension building between the two. Maria could walk away. She knew she could take the high road, avoid the confrontation, and maintain her dignity, but James was watching her, along with several other veterans she'd been counseling, and she realized this moment was about more than just her own pride. You really want to know what I did over there? Maria asked, her voice quiet, but carrying clearly across the square. Buck's grin widened. Oh, this should be good. Tell us all about your war stories, little soldier. Maria looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some were hostile, some curious, and some like James were hopeful. She thought about the tattoo hidden beneath her shirt, about the weight it carried and the story it told. Maybe someday I will, she said finally. But not here, not like this. She turned to walk away, but Buck's voice followed her. That's what I thought. All talk, no action. Just like every other Buck Morrison, that's enough. The sharp voice came from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see Dorothy Chen, the elderly woman who owned the Chinese restaurant, pushing through the gathered people. Despite being barely 5 feet tall and well into her 70s, she commanded attention as she marched up to Buck. You should be ashamed of yourself, Dorothy said, jabbing a finger at Buck's chest. That young woman saved Harold's life 2 weeks ago, and this is how you treat her now, Mrs. Chen, Buck said, his voice losing some of its bluster. This is just a disagreement between its bullying, is what it is, Dorothy interrupted. I've been watching you pick on her since the day she arrived, and I'm sick of it. She pays her rent on time, she's quiet and respectful, and she's helped more veterans in 2 months than this town has helped in years. The crowd was murmuring now, some nodding in agreement with Dorothy's words. Buck looked around, seeming to realize that the mood was shifting against him. Fine, he said finally. But don't come crying to me when your little pet soldier shows her true colors. As the crowd dispersed, Dorothy walked over to Maria. You okay, dear? Maria nodded, touched by the older woman's defense of her. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Dorothy said firmly. I came to this country 40 years ago, and I know what it's like to be judged before people know who you are. But I also know that actions speak louder than words, and your actions have been nothing but good. That evening, Maria sat in her small apartment, thinking about what had happened in the square. She knew the confrontation with Buck was far from over. If anything, it had probably made him more determined to prove her unworthy of the respect she was slowly earning. She touched the spot below her collarbone where her tattoo lay hidden. Soon, she thought, soon they would understand who she really was and what she'd sacrificed for her country. But first, she had more work to do, more veterans to help, and more of their trust to earn. The real test was yet to come. November brought unseasonably warm weather to Pine Valley, and with it, a sense of unrest that seemed to permeate the small town. Maria had been working there for 3 months now, and while her client base continued to grow, the tension with Buck Morrison and his followers had only intensified. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Tommy Rodriguez walked into Maria's office. Tommy was 19 years old, fresh out of basic training, and scheduled to deploy to the Middle East in 2 weeks. But instead of the confidence expected of a young soldier, he carried himself with the weight of someone much older. "I can't do it," Tommy said, slumping into the chair across from Maria's desk. "I thought I could, but I can't. Every time I think about getting on that plane, I can't breathe." Maria studied the young man carefully. She recognized the signs of severe anxiety, but there was something else in his eyes, a deep, bone-crushing fear that went beyond normal pre-deployment nerves. "Tell me what's happening, Tommy," she said gently. The story that emerged broke Maria's heart. Tommy had enlisted at 17 with his parents' permission, eager to serve his country and earn money for college. But during training, he'd been hazed mercilessly by older soldiers who targeted him for his small stature and Hispanic heritage. The abuse had escalated until Tommy was genuinely terrified of what might happen to him downrange, where there would be fewer witnesses and less oversight. "I know what people will think," Tommy said, tears streaming down his face. "They'll say I'm a coward. They'll say I'm not a real man. But I'm scared they're going to get me killed over there, either through neglect or on purpose." Maria felt a familiar anger building in her chest. She'd seen this before: good soldiers, broken by the very system they'd volunteered to serve. But she also knew that Tommy was in a dangerous position. Going AWOL would destroy his future, but deploying in his current mental state could be equally catastrophic. "Tommy, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said. "What you're describing isn't cowardice. It's a legitimate safety concern. Have you reported the hazing to your chain of command?" Tommy shook his head. "Who's going to believe me? It's my word against theirs, and they've been in longer than I have." Maria spent the next 2 hours working with Tommy, helping him understand his options and developing a plan to address the situation through proper channels. She contacted his unit's family readiness group and arranged for a meeting with the base chaplain. Most importantly, she helped Tommy see that seeking help was a sign of strength, not weakness. But word of Tommy's visit to the VA office spread quickly through Pine Valley's tight-knit community. And by evening, Buck Morrison was holding court at the local diner, his voice loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "Now we got young Tommy Rodriguez thinking he's too good to serve his country," Buck announced to his audience. "All because that woman over at the VA office filled his head with nonsense." Maria was having dinner at a corner table, trying to stay invisible, but Buck's words carried clearly across the restaurant. She saw several diners turn to look at her, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. "That boy comes from a good family," Buck continued. "His daddy worked construction for 20 years, his mama cleans houses to make ends meet. They sacrificed everything to give him opportunities, and now he wants to throw it all away because he's scared." James Mitchell, who was eating at the counter, turned around to face Buck. "You don't know what you're talking about. That woman has helped more people than helped them." Buck's voice rose. "She's got half the young men in this town thinking they're victims. Tommy Rodriguez was a fine boy before he started seeing her. Now he's talking about not deploying with his unit. That's what her kind of help gets you." Maria felt every eye in the restaurant turn toward her. The silence was thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the sound of silverware clinking against plates. She could walk away, she knew. She could finish her meal and leave without making a scene. But Tommy was counting on her, and so were the dozen other veterans she'd been counseling. She stood up slowly, placing her napkin on the table, and walked over to where Buck was sitting. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the quiet restaurant. "I couldn't help but overhear you talking about my client." Buck looked up at her with a smug expression. "Oh, your client. Is that what we're calling deserters now?" "Tommy Rodriguez is not a deserter," Maria said firmly. "He's a soldier dealing with a difficult situation, and he's seeking help through appropriate channels." "Appropriate channels," Buck repeated mockingly. "You mean running to you every time something gets tough? What kind of lesson is that teaching our young people?" The restaurant was completely silent now. Every conversation stopped as people watched the confrontation unfold. Maria could feel her heart beating fast, but her voice remained steady. "It's teaching them that it's okay to ask for help when they need it. That seeking support is a sign of wisdom, not weakness." Buck stood up, using his considerable height advantage to loom over her. "You know what I think? I think you're the problem. You come to our town with your fancy degree and your victim mentality, and you poison our kids against everything we stand for." "I'm trying to help people heal from trauma," Maria said, refusing to back down despite Buck's intimidating presence. "Trauma," Buck spat. "You keep using that word like it means something. My generation didn't need counseling. We handled our problems like men. And how did that work out? Maria asked, her patience finally wearing thin. How many of your generation came home from Vietnam and drank themselves to death? How many never talked about what they saw and passed their pain down to their children? How many marriages fell apart because men were taught that real strength meant suffering in silence? A murmur ran through the restaurant, and Maria saw several older diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. She'd hit a nerve, and she knew it. Buck's face flushed red with anger. You got a lot of nerve, little girl, you think, because you put on a uniform for a few years, you understand what real service looks like. I understand what service costs, Maria said quietly. And I understand that taking care of our veterans when they come home is part of the promise we made to them when they left. Service? Buck laughed bitterly. What would you know about real service? You probably never left the safety of some air-conditioned office. You never had to make the hard choices, never had to lead men into danger. The restaurant was so quiet that Maria could hear the clock ticking on the wall behind the counter. She looked around at the faces watching her, some curious, some hostile, but all waiting for her response. You're right about one thing, Buck, she said finally. I have made hard choices. Choices that keep me awake at night. Choices that changed who I am forever. She reached up and slowly unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of her shirt, revealing just enough of the tattoo beneath her collarbone for Buck to see the edge of it. His eyes widened slightly, and Maria saw recognition dawn on his face. But I'm not going to justify my service to you or anyone else in this room, she continued, buttoning her shirt back up. My job is to help veterans heal, and that's exactly what I'm going to keep doing. She turned to walk away, but Buck's voice stopped her, running away, just like I figured you would. Maria turned back slowly, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was steel in her voice. I'm not running, Buck. I'm choosing not to engage in a fight that won't help anyone. But if you keep interfering with my ability to help the veterans in this community, we're going to have a problem. As she walked out of the restaurant, Maria heard the buzz of conversations start up behind her. She knew that by morning, every person in Pine Valley would have heard some version of what had happened at the diner. Some would take Buck's side. Others might begin to question their assumptions about her. But Maria also knew that the real test was still coming. Buck wouldn't let this go, and neither would his supporters. The confrontation at the diner had raised the stakes, and now everyone in town was choosing sides. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Maria touched the tattoo beneath her shirt. Soon, she thought, soon they would all understand the weight of what she carried, and the price she'd paid for the right to help heal the wounds of war. The knock on Maria's door came at 6 in the morning on a cold December day. She'd been awake for hours, unable to sleep after another nightmare about Kandahar, and she answered the door, still wearing her Army PT shirt and shorts. Tommy Rodriguez stood in the hallway, his face pale and his hands shaking. Behind him was his mother, Elena, a small woman with worried eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard labor. Miss Santos, Elena said in accented English, something terrible has happened. Tommy, she broke off. Unable to continue, Maria ushered them into her small apartment and made coffee while Tommy found the courage to speak. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. They found out I was getting counseling, he said. Someone in town must have told someone at the base. Last night, 3 guys from my unit cornered me behind the gas station. They said if I didn't stop being a coward and acting like a victim, they'd make sure I had something real to cry about. Maria felt her blood run cold. Did they hurt you? Tommy shook his head, but his mother spoke up. Show her your arms, mijo. Reluctantly, Tommy rolled up his sleeves, revealing bruises that were clearly finger-shaped. Someone had grabbed him hard enough to leave marks. This is escalating beyond what I can handle alone, Maria said, reaching for her phone. We need to contact the military police, and no, Tommy said quickly. If I report this, it'll get worse. You don't understand what it's like. They have ways of making your life hell without leaving evidence. Maria looked at the frightened young man and his worried mother, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She'd been here before, in a different country, with different faces, but the same desperate need for someone to stand up and do what was right. Tommy, I want you and your mother to go to my supervisor's house, she said, writing down Robert Hayes' address. Tell him I sent you and explain what happened. He'll know what to do. What about you? Elena asked. I'm going to end this, Maria said quietly. An hour later, Maria walked into the Pine Valley Police Department and asked to speak with Chief Patterson. She'd researched him before moving to town and knew he was a veteran himself. Having served in the Navy during the Gulf War, Chief Patterson was a tall, soft-spoken man in his 50s who listened carefully as Maria explained the situation with Tommy Rodriguez and the escalating harassment campaign led by Buck Morrison. "I understand your concern, Miss Santos," he said when she finished. "But what you're describing is mostly name-calling and small-town gossip. That's not illegal even. If it's unpleasant, what about the physical intimidation of Tommy?" Maria asked. Patterson sighed. "Without witnesses or more significant evidence, it's hard to make a case. Boys will be boys, and sometimes things get rough." Maria stared at him, recognizing the same dismissive attitude she'd encountered so many times before. "Chief Patterson, with respect, this isn't boys being boys. This is a pattern of harassment designed to prevent me from doing my job and to intimidate a young soldier who's seeking legitimate help." "Look," Patterson said, leaning back in his chair, "I know Buck can be a hothead, but he's lived in this town his whole life. His family has deep roots here. You're new, and change makes people uncomfortable. Maybe if you tried to fit in better." "Fit in better," Maria interrupted. "You mean if I stayed quiet while veterans in this community suffer because they're afraid to seek help?" Patterson's expression hardened. "I mean maybe if you understood that this is a close-knit community with its own ways of doing things. We take care of our own here." Maria stood up, her patience finally exhausted. "Apparently, your definition of your own doesn't include everyone." As she left the police station, Maria felt the familiar isolation that had followed her through much of her military career. She was used to being the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit, but it never got easier. That afternoon, word spread through town that there would be a community meeting at the VFW hall that evening. Maria wasn't officially invited, but James Mitchell called to warn her that Buck Morrison had been organizing it all day. "It's supposed to be about addressing concerns with outside influences on local veterans," James said, "but everyone knows it's really about you." Maria thought about staying home, avoiding the confrontation entirely, but she knew that hiding would only make things worse for the veterans she was trying to help. If Buck wanted a public forum, she'd give him one. The VFW hall was packed when Maria arrived that evening. She estimated nearly 100 people crammed into the space that normally held half that number. Buck Morrison stood at the front of the room like a politician at a rally, his voice carrying clearly over the crowd. "We're here tonight because our community is under attack," he was saying. "Not from foreign enemies, but from people who want to change our values, our traditions, our way of life." Maria slipped in through the back door and found a spot along the wall. Several people noticed her arrival, and she saw whispers ripple through the crowd. "We've got young men in this town who were proud to serve their country," Buck continued, until certain people started filling their heads with ideas about being victims. "We've got boys who were ready to deploy with their units until they got convinced they were too fragile to handle real service." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Maria saw several heads nodding, but she also noticed some uncomfortable shifting, particularly among the older veterans scattered throughout the audience. "Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't help our veterans," Buck said, his voice taking on a more reasonable tone. "But there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. The right way is what we've always done: family, community, faith, and hard work. The wrong way is teaching people to see themselves as broken." A man in the middle of the crowd stood up. Maria recognized him as Frank Williams, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s. "Buck, with all due respect, maybe some of us needed more help than we got. Maybe if we'd had someone to talk to when we came home, things might have been different." Buck's expression tightened. "Frank, you served with honor. You came home and built a good life. You didn't need anyone to hold your hand." "Didn't I?" Frank shot back. "You don't know about the nights I couldn't sleep. The times I drank too much. The way I snapped at my wife and kids because I couldn't get the war out of my head. Maybe if I'd had someone like Miss Santos to talk to, I could have been a better husband and father." A uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Then another voice spoke up from the back. "Frank's right." Everyone turned to see Harold Jameson, the elderly man Maria had helped during his heart attack. He was using a walker now, but his voice was strong and clear. "That young woman saved my life," Harold said, "and I've watched her work with the veterans in this town. She's not making them weak. She's making them stronger by teaching them it's okay to ask for help." Buck's face was getting red. "Harold, nobody's questioning what she did for you, but helping with a medical emergency and messing with people's heads are two different things, are they?" asked another voice. This time it was Dorothy Chen, who had somehow made her way to the front of the crowd despite her small stature. "I've lived in this town for 40 years, and I've watched good men destroy themselves because they thought asking for help was weakness. I've seen families torn apart because fathers and husbands were too proud to admit they were struggling. The crowd was getting restless now, with multiple conversations breaking out as people debated among themselves. Buck was losing control of his meeting, and Maria could see the frustration on his face. "Enough," he shouted, slamming his hand on the podium. "I didn't organize this meeting to debate the merits of coddling our veterans. I organized it because we have a person in our community who doesn't belong here, who doesn't understand our values, and who's causing more harm than good." The room fell silent again, and Maria felt every eye turned toward her. She realized this was the moment she'd been building toward since the day she arrived in Pine Valley. She could continue to let others fight her battles, or she could step forward and tell her own story. She began walking toward the front of the room, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. As she passed through the crowd, she saw faces she'd come to know over the past few months, some friendly, some hostile, but all waiting to hear what she had to say. When she reached the front, Buck stepped aside with obvious reluctance. Maria looked out at the crowd, seeing Tommy Rodriguez and his mother in the third row, James Mitchell and several other veterans she'd been counseling scattered throughout the audience, and dozens of other faces that had become familiar over her months in Pine Valley. "My name is Maria Santos," she began, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the packed room. "And Buck is right about one thing. I am an outsider. I didn't grow up here, I don't have family roots that go back generations, and I don't fit most people's idea of what a soldier should look like." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But I want to tell you a story about service, sacrifice, and what it really means to take care of our own." Maria reached up and slowly unbuttoned her shirt, pulling it aside to reveal the tattoo beneath her collarbone. The crowd leaned forward, trying to see what it was, but Maria knew that most of them were too far away to make out the details. "This tattoo represents the most important day of my military career," she said. "The day I learned what it really means to leave no one behind." The VFW hall was so quiet that Maria could hear the old buildings settling around them. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, some curious, but all waiting for her to continue. "It was July 15th, 2018, she began, her voice steady despite the memories flooding back. "I was a staff sergeant with the 10th Mountain Division, stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan. I led a squad of 12 soldiers, most of them not much older than Tommy Rodriguez here." She gestured toward Tommy, who was sitting with his mother, his eyes fixed on her face. "We'd been tasked with escorting a convoy of supplies to a remote outpost near the Pakistani border. It should have been routine. We'd done the same mission dozens of times before, but intelligence reports suggested increased Taliban activity in the area, so we were on high alert." Maria paused, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the tattoo beneath her shirt. "My squad was in the lead vehicle, a mine-resistant ambush protected truck and MRAP. Behind us were 2 supply trucks and another MRAP bringing up the rear. The road we were traveling was known for IED attacks, so we were moving slowly, watching for signs of buried explosives." The crowd was completely absorbed now, even Buck Morrison standing silent at the edge of the stage. "About 2 hours into the mission, we came around a bend and saw what looked like a disabled civilian vehicle blocking the road. My training told me it was probably a trap, but my driver, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio named Private First Class David Chun, no relation to Mrs. Chen here, he saw what looked like a family with children standing beside the car. Dorothy Chen's hand flew to her mouth and Maria saw tears beginning to form in the elderly woman's eyes. I made the call to stop and investigate. It went against protocol, but sometimes you have to trust your instincts about people. As we approached the vehicle, I could see it really was a family, a mother, father, and 3 young children. Their car had broken down, and they were stranded in one of the most dangerous areas of Afghanistan." Maria's voice grew quieter, forcing the crowd to lean in to hear her. "While my team was assessing the situation, helping the family move their belongings off the road, our radio operator picked up Taliban communications. They were moving toward our position from multiple directions. We had maybe 10 minutes before we'd be surrounded." She looked directly at Buck Morrison as she continued. "Now, Buck, this is where your definition of real service comes in. I had a choice to make. I could follow standard operating procedure, load up my soldiers, and get out of there as fast as possible. Leave that family to whatever fate awaited them, or I could risk everything to save people who weren't my responsibility, weren't my countrymen, weren't even my mission." Buck's face had gone pale, and Maria could see he was beginning to understand where the story was heading. I chose to stay. I ordered the supply trucks to continue to the outpost while my 2 MRAPs created a defensive perimeter around the family. We loaded them into our vehicles and began moving toward the nearest safe zone, but we were too late. The Taliban had already set up their ambush. Maria's voice remained steady, but those closest to her could see her hands trembling slightly. The first RPG hit the rear vehicle. My friend Sergeant Martinez was the vehicle commander. The explosion flipped the MRAP and trapped 4 of my soldiers inside. The second RPG took out one of our front tires and damaged our radio equipment. We were stranded, under heavy fire, with wounded soldiers and a civilian family depending on us for protection. The silence in the VFW hall was profound. Even the children in the audience seemed to sense the gravity of what they were hearing. The firefight lasted for hours, 4 hours of trading shots with an enemy we couldn't see, while trying to keep everyone alive. Private Chun, that 19-year-old kid from Ohio, took shrapnel in his leg but kept returning fire. Specialist Johnson, barely 21 years old, crawled under enemy fire to treat the wounded in the overturned vehicle. And Corporal Williams, a young woman from Alabama, who couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds, single-handedly held the eastern flank against a Taliban assault. Maria paused, wiping away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts to maintain composure. We lost 2 soldiers that day. Sergeant Martinez died in the explosion of his vehicle. Private Henderson bled out from his wounds before we could get him to a medic. But we saved 6 wounded Americans and a family of 5 Afghan civilians who had done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place at the wrong time. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of as many people as she could. When the rescue helicopters finally arrived, the first thing the flight medic asked me was why we hadn't followed protocol and abandoned the civilians. He said we could have avoided the whole situation if we'd just kept moving. Buck Morrison shifted uncomfortably, and Maria saw him glance toward the exit. You know what I told him? I told him that leaving people behind isn't what we do. That's not what America stands for, and it's not what the uniform represents. We don't abandon people just because helping them is dangerous or inconvenient. Maria reached up and pulled her shirt aside again, this time revealing the full tattoo. To the crowd, it was small but intricate, a pair of dog tags with 5 names etched in elegant script, surrounded by a wreath of poppies. These are the names of the people who died because of my decision, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Not just the 2 American soldiers, but 3 members of that Afghan family who were killed in a Taliban reprisal attack 6 months later. After we'd brought them to safety, a gasp went through the crowd, and Maria saw several people cover their mouths in shock. For 2 years, I carried the guilt of those deaths. I told myself that if I'd followed protocol, if I'd been more concerned with the safety of my own soldiers than with helping strangers, 5 people would still be alive. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. I was consumed by the weight of command decisions that had life and death consequences. She looked directly at Tommy Rodriguez, whose face was wet with tears. And you know what finally helped me heal? Talking to someone, working with a counselor who understood that carrying the weight of other people's lives changes you in ways that can't be fixed with tough love or hard work alone. Learning that seeking help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Maria let her shirt fall back into place, covering the tattoo again. I came to Pine Valley because I wanted to use what I learned about healing to help other veterans, not to make them weak, not to teach them to be victims, but to give them the tools to carry their burdens without being crushed by them. She turned to face Buck Morrison directly. You asked me what I know about real service. Buck, I know that real service means making hard choices when lives are on the line. I know that real service means accepting responsibility for the consequences of those choices. And I know that real service means taking care of each other, especially when it's difficult or uncomfortable. The crowd was completely silent now, many people openly crying. Maria could see the weight of her words, settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Tommy Rodriguez isn't a coward for seeking help. He's a smart young man who recognizes that he needs support before he deploys, not after he comes home broken. The veterans I counsel aren't weak, they're strong enough to admit they can't carry their burdens alone. She looked around the room, one more time, her gaze taking in all the faces that had become familiar over her months in Pine Valley. I didn't ask to be your neighbor, and I know I don't fit most people's idea of what a hero looks like, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere, because this is what real service looks like: showing up, doing the work, and taking care of each other, even when it's hard. Maria walked back through the crowd toward the exit, but before she reached the door, Harold Jameson's voice stopped her. Miss Santos, he called out, struggling to his feet with the help of his walker. I want to thank you. Not just for saving my life, but for saving this community from its own ignorance. One by one, other people began to stand. Frank Williams, the Vietnam veteran, Dorothy Chen, James Mitchell, Tommy Rodriguez, and his mother. Within minutes, nearly half the room was on their feet, applauding. But Maria also noticed who remained seated. Buck Morrison and his core supporters sat with their arms crossed, their faces hard with anger and resentment. She knew this wasn't over. If anything, her revelation had probably made them more determined to drive her out of town. As she walked home through the quiet streets of Pine Valley, Maria felt the familiar weight of her tattoo against her chest. She'd finally told her story, finally revealed the source of her strength and her pain. Some people would understand, others would not, but tomorrow she would go back to work. She would continue counseling veterans, continue fighting for their right to heal, and continue proving that real strength sometimes looked different than people expected. The real battle for Pine Valley's soul was just beginning. The weeks following Maria's revelation at the VFW hall were tense and divided. Pine Valley seemed to split down the middle, with roughly half the town rallying to support her and the other half digging in deeper with Buck Morrison's campaign against her. The support came from unexpected places. Harold Jameson organized a group of older veterans who began meeting weekly at the library to discuss their experiences and the importance of mental health resources. Dorothy Chen started a petition supporting Maria's work that gathered over 200 signatures. Even Chief Patterson, who had been dismissive before, began referring troubled veterans to her office. But the opposition was fierce and sometimes frightening. Someone spray-painted "Go Home" on the side of the Chinese restaurant where Maria lived. Her car tires were slashed twice. Anonymous letters filled with hateful rhetoric appeared under her door. Tommy Rodriguez had deployed with his unit, but not before Maria helped him connect with military mental health resources and a buddy system that would provide support during his deployment. His mother, Alina, became one of Maria's strongest advocates, speaking passionately about how Maria had saved her son from what could have been a tragic mistake. The crisis came on a cold February morning when James Mitchell burst into Maria's office, his face pale and his hands shaking. "It's Danny Foster," he said breathlessly, "Buck's nephew. He's barricaded himself in his trailer with a gun, and he's talking about ending it all." Maria felt her blood run cold. Danny Foster was a 24-year-old Marine veteran who'd returned from deployment 6 months earlier. She'd reached out to him several times, but Buck had forbidden his nephew from seeking counseling, insisting that foster men handled their problems without outside help. "Have the police been called?" Maria asked, already reaching for her coat. "They're on their way, but Buck specifically told them not to let you anywhere near the scene. He says Danny's breakdown is your fault for putting ideas in people's heads." Maria felt the familiar fire building in her chest. A veteran was in crisis, possibly suicidal, and Buck Morrison was more concerned with his pride than his nephew's life. "Where's the trailer?" she asked. "Pine Creek Road, about 2 miles out of town. But Maria, Buck has half a dozen of his friends out there with him. If you show up, things could get ugly." "Things are already ugly," Maria said grimly. "A Marine veteran is threatening to take his own life. Everything else is secondary." The drive to Pine Creek Road took 12 minutes, but it felt like hours. When Maria arrived, she found a scene of controlled chaos. 2 police cars blocked the road, their red and blue lights flashing. An ambulance waited nearby. A small crowd of onlookers stood behind yellow tape, including Buck Morrison and several of his supporters. Chief Patterson was talking into a megaphone, trying to establish communication with Danny, who was holed up in a single wide trailer at the end of a gravel driveway. "Danny, this is Chief Patterson. Your uncle Buck is here, and he wants to talk to you. Can you come to the door?" No response came from the trailer, but Maria could see movement behind the curtained windows. She approached Chief Patterson, but Buck Morrison intercepted her. "This is your fault," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "All your talk about trauma and victimhood, you put these ideas in his head." "Buck, your nephew is in crisis," Maria said, trying to keep her voice calm. "This isn't the time for blame, it's time to get him help." "Help?" Buck's voice rose. "The kind of help you gave Tommy Rodriguez. Turn our boys into cowards who run crying to counselors instead of handling their problems like men." Chief Patterson turned around, his face showing the strain of the situation. "Buck, I need you to keep your voice down. We don't want to agitate Danny any further." "What's his military background?" Maria asked the chief quietly. 2 tours in Iraq, saw heavy combat, been struggling since he got home but refused to get help. Buck convinced him that seeking counseling would be admitting weakness. Maria felt her heart sink. She'd seen this scenario too many times. In crisis, family members who meant well but whose misguided attempts to help only made things worse. "Chief, I might be able to help," she said. "I have experience with crisis intervention, and I understand what he's going through." Buck whirled around to face her. "Absolutely not. You've done enough damage. Danny doesn't need some outsider messing with his head. He needs someone who understands combat trauma," Maria said firmly. "Someone who's been where he is." Buck laughed bitterly. "What could you possibly understand about what a real Marine has been through?" Before Maria could respond, a voice came from the trailer's doorway. Danny Foster appeared, visible through the screen door, holding what looked like a pistol. "I can hear you out there arguing," he called out, his voice slurred and desperate. "Just leave me alone. I'm tired of being broken. I'm tired of pretending I'm okay." Chief Patterson raised the megaphone again. "Danny, nobody thinks you're broken. Your family loves you, and we want to help." "Help?" Danny's voice cracked. "Uncle Buck says getting help is for weaklings. Says I should be able to handle this on my own, but I can't. I see my buddies who didn't make it home every time I close my eyes. I hear the explosions. I can't make it stop." Maria felt tears streaming down her face. This was exactly what she'd been trying to prevent, a young veteran destroyed by stigma and misguided pride. "Let me talk to him," she said to Chief Patterson. "No way," Buck interrupted. "You're not getting anywhere near my nephew." "But Chief," Patterson was looking at Maria with new understanding. "What did you have in mind?" "Let me tell him he's not alone, that what he's feeling is normal, that there's a way through this that doesn't involve ending his life." Buck stepped in front of her. "Over my dead body. You've poisoned this town against everything we stand for. I won't let you destroy what's left of my family. Your family is destroying itself." Maria shot back, her patience finally exhausted. "Your nephew is suicidal because he's been taught that asking for help makes him weak. He's in there right now, believing that his only choices are to suffer in silence or end his pain permanently." "That's enough," Buck said, raising his hand, as if to strike her, but before he could move, another voice cut through the tension. "Buck Morrison, you take one more step toward that woman and I'll arrest you myself." Everyone turned to see Harold Jameson making his way slowly toward them with his walker, followed by Frank Williams, Dorothy Chen, and a dozen other Pine Valley residents. "Harold, this is none of your business," Buck said, but his voice had lost some of its bluster. "The hell it isn't," Harold replied, his voice stronger than anyone had heard it in years. "That boy in there is one of ours, and right now he needs help, not your damn fool pride." Frank Williams stepped forward. "Buck, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and I'm telling you right now your nephew needs what that woman can give him. She's been where he is. She's been where he is," Buck repeated mockingly. "What, in some air-conditioned office somewhere?" Dorothy Chen, despite being barely 5 feet tall, pushed through the group to stand directly in front of Buck. "You listen to me, you stubborn fool. That woman has seen more combat than half the men in this town. She's lost people, made life and death decisions, and lived with the consequences. If anyone can reach your nephew, it's her." Chief Patterson made a decision. "Miss Santos, you have 5 minutes. But if this goes sideways, it won't," Maria said. Already walking toward the trailer, she stopped about 20 feet from the door, close enough to speak normally but far enough away to avoid seeming threatening. "Danny," she called out. "My name is Maria Santos. I'm a veteran too. Army 3 combat deployments. I'd like to talk to you." "Go away," Danny's voice came through the screen door. "I don't need another person telling me to tough it out." "I'm not here to tell you to tough it out," Maria said. "I'm here to tell you that what you're feeling right now, the guilt, the pain, the exhaustion, it's normal, and it's not permanent." There was silence from the trailer, but Maria could see Danny's silhouette behind the screen door. "I lost friends too, Danny, good people who should have made it home but didn't. For a long time, I thought their deaths were my fault. I thought I should have been able to save them, and when I couldn't, I thought maybe I should have died instead." "You don't understand," Danny said, his voice breaking. "I left them. When the IED went off, I ran. I left my squad leader and 3 other Marines behind." Maria felt her heart break for the young man. "Danny, did you go back for them? What? After you ran, did you go back?" There was a long pause. Yeah, I went back. We all did. But Martinez was already gone, and Thompson died in my arms while we waited for the medic." "Then you didn't abandon them," Maria said gently. "You survived an explosion, you regrouped, and you went back to help your brothers. That's not cowardice, Danny. That's what Marines do." "But I ran first," Danny said, and Maria could hear him. Crying now, so did I, Maria admitted. When that first RPG hit, my first instinct was to get as far away as possible, but training kicked in, and I did my job, just like you did yours. She took a step closer to the trailer. Danny, that survivor instinct you're ashamed of, that's what kept you alive so you could go back and help your friends. There's no shame in being human. For several minutes, there was no sound from the trailer. The crowd behind the police tape had grown to include nearly 50 people, but everyone remained silent, waiting to see if Maria could reach the desperate, young veteran. Finally, Danny's voice came through the door again, quieter now. How do you make it stop? The dreams, the guilt, the feeling like you're drowning all the time. You get help, Maria said simply. You talk to people who understand. You learn that carrying the weight of war doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. And you discover that healing is possible, even when it doesn't feel like it. The screen door creaked open, and Danny Foster stepped out onto the small porch. He was a tall, thin young man with hollow eyes and the unmistakable bearing of a Marine, even in his pajamas and bare feet. The pistol hung loosely in his right hand. Will you help me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Maria said without hesitation. But first, I need you to put down the gun. Danny looked down at the weapon in his hand as if seeing it for the first time. Slowly, carefully, he placed it on the porch railing and stepped away from it. Chief Patterson and the paramedics moved in quickly, securing the weapon and beginning to assess Danny's condition. As they worked, Buck Morrison approached Maria, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. I was wrong, he said quietly, so that only she could hear. About you, about Danny, about everything. I almost let my pride kill my nephew. Maria looked up at the big man who had made her life so difficult. Seeing him clearly for the first time, beneath the bluster and hostility, she saw fear of change, fear of admitting weakness, fear of a world that no longer made sense to him. We all make mistakes, Buck, she said. What matters is what we do next. As the ambulance pulled away, with Danny Foster inside, Maria felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Harold Jameson, leaning heavily on his walker but smiling. You did good today, young lady. That boy's going to be okay because of you. Maria looked around at the crowd of townspeople who had gathered to support her, then at Buck Morrison, who was staring after the ambulance with tears in his eyes. We all did good today, she said. We took care of one of our own. 3 months later, Pine Valley held its annual Memorial Day ceremony in the town square. Danny Foster, looking healthier and stronger after weeks of intensive counseling, read the names of local veterans who had given their lives in service to their country. When he finished, he looked out at the crowd and said, I want to thank someone who taught me that asking for help isn't giving up, it's choosing to live. Miss Santos, would you join me up here? Maria walked through the crowd to the small stage, feeling the eyes of the entire town on her. Some of those eyes still held reservations, but most showed acceptance, respect, and gratitude. Buck Morrison was in the front row, sitting next to his nephew. When Maria reached the stage, Buck stood up and began to clap. One by one, the rest of the crowd joined him, until the entire town square rang with applause. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Maria touched a tattoo beneath her collarbone. The names were still there, they would always be there, but the weight felt different now, lighter somehow, shared among a community that had learned to carry each other's burdens. She thought about Tommy Rodriguez, serving overseas with the support system she'd helped him build. She thought about Danny Foster, alive and healing because people had been willing to admit that sometimes strength looks like vulnerability. She thought about all the veterans she'd counseled, and all the ones still to come. Pine Valley had taught her something important, that healing wasn't just an individual process, but a community one. That sometimes the hardest battles were fought, not on foreign soil, but in the hearts and minds of people who had forgotten how to take care of each other. As she walked home through the familiar streets of her adopted town, Maria Santos, veteran, counselor, and reluctant hero, smiled. She had found her place at last, not despite being different, but because of it. And tomorrow she would continue the work of healing, one veteran, one family, one heart at a time. The tattoo beneath her collarbone would always remind her of the cost of service, but now it also reminded her of something else, that no one has to carry their burdens alone.